Hello and welcome to the Language Revolution podcast. My name is Kate Hamilton. I'm a languages teacher and founder of Babel Babies. The aim of this podcast is to get people talking about talking. So without further ado, let's get started. Today I'm talking to Dr Katerina Kantartzis, or Katerina Draper, from the University of Gloucestershire. She's a senior lecturer in psychology and an expert in child language acquisition. Hi, Kat.
Hello.
Morning. Thanks for coming in and chatting to me.
Thank you for having me.
So we are going to talk about how do children learn to speak, because it's a really amazing process.
Yeah.
And we'd like to understand what are the stages and some of the things that parents can do to support their children learning language or languages. Mm-hmm. So talk us through a little bit then. So when do children start learning to speak?
Well, I think people will be surprised to hear that actually it starts in the womb.
Okay.
Sort of mid to late pregnancy, we know that sound waves are going through to the womb. Baby's going to be able to be picking up. Their ears are starting to develop, so they're getting that stimulation really, really early on. And sort of evidence for this is that as soon as they're born, babies who are a few hours old can actually tell their mother's voice. They can distinguish between their native language, for example. And we do this through an experimental method called the high amplitude sucking paradigm.
Okay.
So what we know is that babies who find things sort of familiar or interesting will suck harder on a dummy than those if it's not something that they're particularly interested in. So they become stimulated by it, if you like.
Okay.
So we've got these special dummies that have sensors in them. And what we found was that when baby listened to their mother's voice compared to just another female voice, they sucked harder when they heard their mother's voice. And equally when they heard their native language over a different language, or even their native language played in sort of the right order versus their native language played in reverse order.
Oh, right. So if they hear, say they're an English speaking baby, if they hear English backwards,
they don't like it. Yeah, they don't like it. So they're really in tune to sort of, A, obviously the sound of their mother's voice, but B, their language, what it sounds like, the types of intonations, what to expect the sound pattern to look like or sound like, if you like.
So it's about the kind of the intonation and like the rhythm of it. Okay, amazing. So when they're in, so when you're pregnant, your baby can hear the rhythm and then they're ready to recognise this at birth. Yeah. That's amazing. Yeah. So when they're born, what are the first sort of steps that they go through to learn to speak? Yeah,
so when they're constantly learning to speak, if you like. From day one, you know, they are becoming communicative beings. You know, they're crying, they're smiling, they're gurgling. All of that is allowing that communication pattern to start. We know as new parents that when your baby starts making a sound, at first it'll be crying. We respond to it. So we show them that you're making a sound, you're producing this vocalization, and I, as somebody else in the world, I'm going to respond to that. Okay. I'm going to give you a cuddle, or I'm going to change your nappy, or I'm going to see if you need a feed. You know, all of this is the beginnings of that communication, that social interaction that shows babies that these noises and these facial expressions and these gestures that I produce, because that's all of those form language, are important and people respond to them.
So it's actually part of the care process. So the baby is trying to extract care from you.
Absolutely. It's so important. You know, if you can imagine, you know, thousands of years ago we'd have been in the wild and baby needed to make sure that its parents were going to look out for it when it was in danger. Yeah. And so making sure that sort of instinctual process of you're listening to me, you're responding to me, you like me because I'm smiling at you. Yeah. You know, all of that is ensuring their survival.
So it is actually a survival mechanism to get your caregivers to come and, well, basically not abandon you in the forest. Yeah. Because human babies are quite useless, really, aren't they?
They really are. It's not particularly my area of expertise, but apparently human babies are born much earlier in terms of their development than pretty much any other species. You know, if you think of, you know, the standard farmyard animals, they're up and walking within a day or two, if that. You know, sometimes it's even sooner than that. But human babies take months. So they really need that care and support from their parents. They need to make sure that their parents are responding to them.
So it starts straight away at birth. They are eliciting our responses. So as they go through the first few weeks then, they are actually, perceiving and developing their communication skills.
And actually, sorry, I'm going to go back a step because I forgot to say that even before they're born, they're starting that communication pattern. We've all got the classic example of baby jumps when there's a loud noise, and when they're in the womb, they respond to a loud noise, or maybe their cat purring or something on the mum's tummy, they might respond to that. So there's always things that mums say that, oh yeah, baby always used to react to, so-and-so. So I would say even that's maybe the beginnings of that communication process. So sorry, go back to what you were saying. So in the first weeks, they're developing, they're starting to think about, how am I going to communicate? They're listening to language. They're looking for that really important child-carer interaction, which is important on many levels, but language as well, where the parent and the child almost develop sort of this dance sequence where they're communicating and they're chatting and they're giggling, and maybe mummy or daddy is tickling them, for example. And babies often become overstimulated, for example, and they might look away or they might get a bit sort of quieter. And typically it's mum, so I'm going to refer to mum, but obviously it can be anyone who's interacting with the child, very quickly becomes sensitive to those sort of patterns of communication where baby's going, hang on a minute, I need a break now.
And so then the cues, would you call them?
Absolutely, the cues that the baby's giving to say that, okay, I'm ready to interact now, and give me lots of smiles and lots of giggles and tickles, and actually now I need a bit of a break, just stop for a second, and then in a few seconds or a few minutes I might pick back up again. So they're really developing that social dance with their caregivers to make sure that they're creating that interaction.
It almost feels like a chemical process. It's like sometimes I look back at the videos of my first child, in the early days, and I can't see what, why was I videoing him? He wasn't actually doing anything. But at the time, I was so incredibly sort of sensitive to every movement and everything. If you show someone else who's not, interested in your baby this video, it's like, are they actually doing anything? They just look like they're lying there.
Exactly. And that's really that's a really good example of a parent being really sensitive to small changes, or but which are huge developments for the baby. But actually, for a third person, they're kind of going,
that's nice.
This is interesting. Great, thanks for sharing.
So a new baby's got a really rapid sort of acquisition of the world, basically, haven't they? And they've got billions of new synapses.
Absolutely, they've got loads. So the first 2 years, they've got just keep producing and strengthening and using all these thousands and millions and billions of synapses in their brain. And it's sort of by the age of 2, evidence currently shows that we've got more synapses than we'll ever have in our brain. So I heard a really good example recently, which was somebody said that if a 2-year-old's having a tantrum over something because they think what you're doing is wrong, because of all these synapses, the toddler's probably right, which I thought was quite a funny,
comforting to parents,
because they've got way more brain connections than you do. But no, jokes aside, they're learning everything. They're just absorbing everything in the world. In a couple of months, new parents will be starting to hear noises coming from the babies, the cooing, the gurgling, the classics of practicing using their vocal cords, even the crying, that screaming, the high pitch, that's opening their lungs, it's getting their vocal cords working, it's all interacting to make this being that will, within 12 months, start producing their first words.
It's a physical process as well, isn't it? As it's not just, I know I want to say this. It's like, how do I get the air through the vocal folds and out of my mouth? It's actually really complex.
And shaping your mouth and where your tongue needs to be in the mouth in order to produce the right sounds. Don't start thinking about it when you're talking, because you'll get really tongue twisted. But, what your mouth is actually doing on a physical level is really quite amazing.
Yes, it's a really complex process. So they start to say things at around what kind of age? Like,
so most parents will say that baby will say, you know, mama or dada or gaga or, you know, one of these very simple CVCV sounds, as we call them. So constant vowel. So sort of combining those noises together. Exactly. Yeah, and often parents will think, oh, they've said the first word. And actually, you know, this could be why in most languages that I know of, mum is is around the sounds of ma and ma, and, you know, variations of
lots
it,
of languages, mama or maman, there's a ma involved.
Absolutely. Yes. Because it does tend to be some of the first sounds that babies combine. And
is that just because mums by sort of 6 months were desperate to be recognised?
Yeah, I think so. You know, going back to our argument on evolution, they need to survive. They need to make sure that mums are, you know, really in tune with them and excited, and they're sort of, we know that by 6 or 7 months you might be exhausted, you might be, you know, you need that.
It's been a long 6 months by the time you've got to 6 months.
Absolutely. So I don't think it's a coincidence. I think, you know, nature and humanity has worked very well together to create this sort of period.
Don't give up now, Mum.
Exactly.
I just said your name.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So that happens around 6 to 7 months. And then by about 12 months, we're hearing sort of clear first words. So, and they can be really random. You know, they're often things like up or, you know, if you've got a cat, they might label the cat because that just happens to be something that they're
it's a highly frequent object.
Exactly.
Isn't it?
So that's when sort of maybe the more, like, they're not random, but more random, not just mama and dada, might come up as about 12 months.
Okay. And so around 12 months, what they might have, like one or two or?
One or two words. You know, and then all the way up to sort of the first 2 years, which is sort of this explosion of language where they go from sort of single words and suddenly you realise they're putting 2 words together, and before you know it they're putting 3, and then it's 5, 6, 10. Before you know it they're singing the words to all the songs that they know. And you know, around about 2 years you're expecting them to start forming those 2 to 3 word sentences. But again,
so things like "Daddy gone." I remember
exactly. Yeah.
I remember saying, "Well, yeah, I'm still here." But yeah, so "Daddy gone," and you know, things like cars and buses. These were really interesting. You know, oh look, bus.
So often it'll be look something or up, or you know, some families really stress saying please, so it might be water please, you know, just those very simple.
And more, I remember my children saying, you know, more of something.
Absolutely.
Okay. So you go through so about 18 months you're saying maybe some wider vocabulary and some word pairs, and
absolutely.
And then what comes after that sort of stage? So by the time they're 2, are we thinking they've got?
By the time they're 2, you might be, you know, you'd be hoping that they've got a good sized vocabulary. It really varies.
I've heard about 50 words average, but you know, there's
around about that.
Important to stress, I think, there isn't an exact number.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. You know, it's around about that. Some will have way more, and some will have much fewer than that.
So it's a range, really, isn't it?
It is, absolutely. And that's the thing with all of sort of research and psychology in particular, is that we're looking for sort of means, as we call them. So what's the average? And as you say, there's babies or children who will fall at the lower end of that range, and babies who will fall at the higher end of that range, and you know, within reason, it's all fine.
So it's pretty useless actually to compare, you know, babies within a baby group. You know, so if you know your child is you know, saying 1 or 2 things, and someone else is saying 10, you can feel a bit worried, perhaps. But are there some markers for things if you know, perhaps you know, you might be concerned if?
I think one of the really important things, and one of the first things to develop, is the social eye gaze, as we call it. And that's where baby will look from an object back to, say, the mum, if that's who's present, and wait for that label to be given. So they might see something, say they've just seen a dog for the first time, or they've just become aware of a dog in the park, and they look at the dog and they look back at the mum, and the mum needs to be in tune at what the baby's been looking at and label it.
Okay.
And that's really important, that interaction, that sort of triangulation of, I'm looking at something, you're saying a word, and I'm sort of labelling that object in the world.
You're actually really taking me back now, because I remember, you're having a conversation with someone who's not speaking, but you actually do know that they are seeking out this information.
Absolutely.
So you go, oh yes, look, it's a dog.
Yeah.
Well done.
And it can go the other way as well, that, you think, oh gosh, they've never seen a double-decker bus before, and you go, oh, look, it's a big bus, for example, or you might choose to call it a double-decker bus, it depends, and you go, oh, look at the big bus, and baby will look at you and back at the object that you're pointing at or looking at.
So this is called, what did you say? The
social eye gaze.
Social eye gaze, okay. So, and this is a precursor to taking conversational sort of turns back and forth.
And it's an indication that babies are interested. So what we really care about at about 2 years is not necessarily the number of words, is are they interested? Because that's really important. If they're interested in learning words, if they're interested in labelling objects in the world, then, we're pretty confident that, things are fine. They'll
it will all
up
come together.
The words eventually. And that's something to encourage, if parents are a bit worried for whatever reason, then, do that social referencing, and you can start off really close. So, maybe holding an object and showing baby what it's called, and then eventually you can point to it. So
this presumably is why reading is really good. So if you've got, a book and you're talking about the pictures and, and then when you're out, you say, oh, look, and there's a dog, like in our book, Harry McClary or something.
We love Harry McClary.
Yeah. So it's really just about, not waiting for them to be productive, but just that they're paying attention.
Absolutely.
And you can tell that they're listening.
And if you think about it, the whole process of learning language is really complicated. You're making this noise that's coming out of your mouth, and baby has to understand that the particular pattern of sounds that's coming out of your mouth labels a specific object or event in the world, and they have to make that link.
It's a connection.
So it's actually quite amazing what they're doing, and that if they're wanting and they're understanding that link could be there, is a great sign that they are developing language. They're wanting to be sociable with it,
and so they're on their language learning journey. Whereas if you notice that they weren't, like looking and perhaps you might get their hearing checked or something just to make sure there's not like a barrier to.
What I always say is, it's like a child having a cough. If the cough's gone on for a bit too long, you're not really sure, and it doesn't feel right, then just talk to somebody about it. The worst that can happen is you turn up and they go, you're being over anxious, there's nothing wrong with them, carry on. And that's fine.
Parents' instincts, though, need to be trusted, don't they? Because we've got into a little bit of an expert sort of overriding parental instinct. So basically, if you feel that they're not really kind of paying attention or like communicating, then just follow it up, and no one's going to, tell you off for checking it out.
We're really lucky in this area. In Cheltenham, there's lots of drop-in clinics, for example, with speech and language therapists at some of the children's centres. There's obviously private ones as well. Just go and ask somebody. And if they're a little bit concerned, they might give you some advice of things you can practice, things like blowing through a straw because it strengthens mouth muscles, for example, or practicing that social aspect of language. So there's lots of little things that people can recommend, experts can recommend.
And so for parents who want to support, good language acquisition for their children, I always imagine it's a little bit like being a TV chef and you're narrating everything that you're doing. Yeah. So, because sometimes you can feel a little bit false talking to someone who's not responding with words. Obviously they're responding with eye contact and that sort of thing. So if you were just in the kitchen and your baby's in their little bouncer chair and you're emptying the dishwasher, is that a good...
Just narrate. Just say what you're doing, Oh, I'm just taking out the plates and, oh gosh, look, we've got 4 forks today and let's put them back in the right place. And so, just talk to them about what's going on in the world. As you say, it feels a bit awkward at first when you're first doing it, but then it becomes quite natural. And I think to add into that, it's really important that you also respond to baby. So if baby starts cooing, even at a couple of months, if they're looking at you and they start making a noise, stop what you're saying, just as if there was another adult in the room, and go, oh yeah, that's really interesting, I hadn't thought of that. Or, oh yeah, I did miss a fork, there's 5 actually, well noticed. And that might not have been what they were indicating. They might have just been making a noise because, they're starting to get hungry, but actually you're showing them how that,
how a conversation
power
works
in the conversation. I think that's really important.
And it encourages them to make more interactions like that. And if you're, stuck for something to do, you could just pick up a book and talk through that, or sing a song.
Songs are great.
Why are songs good, actually? Because that's,
So, there seems to be something special about singing in and of itself. So aside from learning language, singing seems to make us happier. There's loads of work now in terms of singing with the elderly, for example, or singing with people who might have mental health problems. There seems to be something special about singing and humans. And you find it in all cultures, which for me is always a big sign that there's something special about it.
And through time as well.
Absolutely.
Humans have always sung,
and we've told
with their babies.
Stories through it. We've kept things alive through songs. So, and I think that's true with babies as well. There seems to be something really special about singing. I think it makes mum feel better because there's something about singing that's important to us as humans. Babies respond to it because it's quite melodic. It's it's soothing, and
presumably it reinforces the intonation of the language you're singing in as well. It's sort of and catch, easy to catch on to how to form the phrases and things. So if you're singing a song, your baby's brain is absorbing lots of different aspects of it. Obviously it's about the song and the words, but also about the feelings, and it's kind of a unit of good care model, really, isn't it?
And you might you might be singing Incy Wincy Spider, and babies never really had any. I mean, they've got a concept of rain, and that they've been out in their pushchair with the rain cover on top, for example. But then, you realise 2 years down the line that every time it rains, they sing Incy Wincy Spider. So they've made that link between, again, sort of quite an abstract song, words. We talked about how language is abstract in the sense of it's just noises that we make. And some, an event in the world, and they've assigned it to it, which I think is quite fascinating.
Yeah. So talking about the abstract then, so in our previous conversations, we've talked about how babies can hear sounds and they link them to, this is language. But then there's also a point where a sound just becomes a noise, like a tapping pencil on a table is a noise, but it doesn't signify language. So in the first couple of years, are babies particularly sensitive to all sounds? Or?
So going back to sort of what we said about the synapses and them having loads of things active in their brain in the first couple of years, and included in those is lots of different language sounds. So basically what we think is happening is when babies are born, they are sensitive to all language sounds. So anything in any language, they can hear, they can perceive, they can process in their brain. At about the age of 2, they start sort of lessening their awareness, if you like, to the ones that maybe aren't as relevant. So, I'll put it into context. If you've got a baby that's learning just English in the home and has never really heard any other language, they're not going to need, say, African click sounds to be active in their perception of sounds, because it's not something they need.
Because it won't elicit care from their caregivers. I mean, that's is that what language is for, is to be looked after.
And also we like to be quite efficient in our brains. So if something's not being used, we like to sort of file it away. That doesn't mean it's lost. It just means it's not on your desk, if you like.
Okay.
So, for example, there's research by some colleagues in Vancouver in Canada, Janet Worker and her lab, who look at lots of different speech sounds. So the classic one is Japanese adults who can't tell the difference between L and R. Quite a common example. It's used quite a lot in academic talks. But what we do know is that Japanese infants under the age of 2 can tell the difference between L and R. So we know that at some point, all these adults who, no longer are able to pronounce L and R differently would have been able to.
Yeah, so it's about whether they had the exposure to that.
Exactly.
And it's a need-to-know basis, isn't it? Like,
absolutely.
if you don't need to know it, then...
Yeah, it's the same with African clicks. You know, as an English speaker, if you hear an African clicks language, it's mind-blowing. You know, if you've never heard it before, it just, as you say, it just sounds maybe like a pen tapping or, you know, a sound you might make to cattle, for example, you know, like...
I do it to my cat.
Example. Exactly. So it's, you know, for us to recognise sort of some of the small differences in some of these clicks that make them into different speech sounds is pretty much impossible as adults if we've never heard it before.
Yeah, it would take a really long time to
absolutely.
build
it's
up
not
the
that it's not possible, but it would be really, I mean, you know, if you listen, you won't be able to hear all the different sounds. Whereas babies who have been growing up in an English-speaking household can hear the difference between African clicks.
In an African click-speaking household, they can, you know, if they've had the exposure, they would, you know, just naturally bring that into their repertoire.
Yes,
exactly. Yeah. Amazing. So the sensitive periods then, we're getting to sort of age 2 and, you know, we don't like to talk about the critical window because as Thomas Back and I were chatting about in our first series, you don't just suddenly wake up one morning and that's it. You know, the window is closed, you can't learn anymore, but it's just you're particularly in tune in your first 2 years. And you were saying that at 2, you've got the most capacity.
Yeah, absolutely. I think critical period's a bit misleading because as you say, it makes it sound as if beyond that point, all is lost.
Yes.
And that's particularly with language, that's absolutely not the case. You know, we've all got examples either of our own or friends who have learnt a new language from scratch at the age of 15, for example, or 9 or 10 or even 50. So, you know, I think critical period's a bit...
Especially it's easier when you're very young.
Yeah, absolutely.
To, you know, just bring it into your natural ease of use of the sounds and the grammar and the vocabulary. But it's not a window.
No, it's like the analogy that I used with the cabinet and the desk. We keep the languages that we've been exposed to and we use regularly on the desk in front of us to use, and then we have a whole host of other sounds that we haven't used or we haven't been exposed to in a cabinet. That doesn't mean that cabinet can't be opened,
and it can indeed be opened many years later.
Absolutely.
Like there's that piece of research with Korean orphans who have been adopted into Dutch families, and they haven't really heard Korean sort of since the age of 1, and some of the babies were 6 or 5 months old when they moved to the Netherlands, and then they did a Korean course in their 20s with a control group who'd never heard Korean, and the babies who'd had Korean exposure were just much better at producing Korean sounds. Yeah,
and these were babies who weren't aware that they knew Korean in any way, you know, in a sort of
in a conscious way. Yeah, they hadn't sort of that wasn't part of their conscious mind. I don't know if I'm getting my vocabulary correct there, but they, you know, it was stored away. It's just amazing, isn't it? You know,
it's brilliant.
So let's have a think then about some of the concerns if you are not interacting with your child. So basically, you know, your parents are talking to children and they're trying to, you know, encourage communication back and forth, etc. So we've had lots of interesting conversations before about cases of neglect where children have not been exposed to sound. So how does that work? So a famous example is Jeannie in America, isn't it?
So she's quite a famous example. She was found quite late on. I think it's about 11 or 12 years old. And she had been basically locked in a room on her own in you know, very unfavourable circumstances. Her parents didn't interact with her. She had very little stimulation from the environment. I can't remember exactly, but I don't think she had any toys or anything available to her. She spent quite a lot of time strapped to a potty. So, you know, really horrendous situation. And when she was found, obviously she hadn't developed any language. And, you know, researchers worked with her quite extensively to try, not just researchers and care workers, to try and develop her language. And, you know, she did. She learnt a few words. She was able to use, you know, maybe some gestures, maybe some pictures to help communicate. So there was an element of communication there. But actually, she never really learnt language to any sort of usable capacity in sort of typical society, if you like. You know, you would always be able to tell that there was something different about her language abilities, if you like.
So that's a tricky one, because we don't know the exact circumstances of her early life, do we?
Exactly.
So you can't say whether she was on a trajectory for, you know, the mean language development anyway.
And that's the, you know, the unfortunate point about lots of these children who are found and are found to these days. You know, there's still children being found in situations where they've been neglected by their parents.
But there was a really high-profile case a few months ago in Russia, wasn't there?
Yeah. So, but the issue is that we don't actually know, as you say, what the circumstances prior to neglect were. So these quite often might be children who might not have had the capacity to develop language anyway. And you know, I'm not justifying it in any way, of course, but you know, often parents might struggle with a child who's not developing typically, and that might lead to you know, some of the situations we see, as horrendous as that is, we can never exclude that. So it's really hard to draw conclusions about
when you
language
can only see
development,
one side
when we
of
can
the
only, you know, we only
equation.
have the child once it's been through this horrendous situation. What we can compare studies, say like Genie, to is the equivalent, say that when children have been neglected, but say not on their own.
Right.
So say twin pairs, for example. I think there was a twin pair. I think they were in Russia again, but I can't remember exactly. And they, again, had been neglected by their parents. They were found a little bit younger than Jeannie. I think they were found at about the age of 7. But they went on actually to develop, very typically, they acquired language. I think they went on to get degrees at university and become, you know, in their way, successful in the world. Not to say that having to have a degree is what's going to make you successful, but, you know, to put into context there,
it didn't hold them back
very well after being found. So, you know...
So the fact that they had been together...
Yeah, I mean, I feel like that makes a huge difference because they had the opportunity to develop an interaction, a type of communication with each other, whereas Jeannie was completely solitary. She had no opportunity to develop communication with anyone. And I think that's probably quite a vital
So it really is a very social thing, isn't
Very
it?
social,
Language.
yeah,
You know, we develop it in a context of other beings. And you've given me before an example of the Nicaraguan
so that's
orphans. What's that about?
So in Nicaragua, there was a large population of deaf children who were institutionalized. And at the time, there was no official sign language training or any sort of training to help them communicate, which meant that you had a whole group of children who couldn't develop verbal language. And they developed their own sign language.
Wow.
And the first sort of generation, if you like, of Nicaraguan children, it was a very iconic language. So, you know, numbers, for example, would be very much reliant on digits on your fingers, of your fingers. And then as you see them going through their generations, if you like, so as the next... So as the next stage of children who were taught by the first generation, as they learnt the language, it became more and more abstract. So they could make it more complex.
Oh, wow. So it actually, well, just like any language, I presume, like with, you know, generations teaching the next one, it develops its own...
And it changes and adapts and becomes more useful for the situation that they're in, I guess. Yeah, so it's fascinating.
This is pushing us towards the idea that it's Chomsky who has this innate... Language is an innate human driver, like something that we do intuitively. You can't really stop humans from communicating.
No, and Chomsky talks about the language acquisition device. So this is some kind of mechanism within the brain that sort of, if you like, intuitively picks up language and stores it in the right way and allows you to process it. And as you say, it's sort of, you can't stop it in a typical situation. Obviously, we talked about neglect and deprivation. But yeah, that there's something there. There's other theories, there's the behaviourist theory who believe that it's very much based around, I guess this is the other extreme from Chomsky, who believe that reinforcement is what causes language. So behaviourists are people who believe in reward and punishment, and broadly speaking, that you can make a behaviour stronger by rewarding it. The classic sort of dogs drooling, that they drool more when you give them
more biscuits.
More biscuits, thank you. Went blank there for a second. And you can stop a behaviour if you punish it. So if they're given an electric shock every time they try and go and eat, they'll stop and try and go to eat. So that's how language develops as well. So babies get this positive reinforcement when they start, particularly around the first few words. When they say that mama, mummy gets very excited and clapping and excited, and that's what's encouraging them to develop their language. I think
that's actually quite useful if you're looking at older, like teenagers and adults learning a language, because if you don't get positive reinforcement through, say, GCSE French, you're going to feel really put off. And then I've seen quite a lot of adults who've come to babies classes, and they have obviously been emotionally damaged by the lack of positive reinforcement. So maybe it works in sort of not duality, but there's a balance of different things happening, isn't it? We want to communicate, it's natural, but then if we feel punished for taking the first steps, we're going to be put off doing it, aren't we?
Absolutely. I think, with a lot of theories in psychology, and this is a good example of it, it's sort of a balance of lots of different things going on. I definitely think there's a place for reinforcement, and if you've got a bad experience, it's going to put you off.
Yes.
We're not robots. Different people will be put off to different levels, and some people will decide not to be put off. But there does seem to be a mechanism there that allows us to learn language relatively naturally, given the right circumstances. But also that be positive, give them some praise, and it encourages it further.
Oh, lovely. So just to draw this part of our conversation to conclusion, so if you are a parent, you can encourage your child's language acquisition process just by interacting with them.
Absolutely.
And it's natural for them to sort of seek out a response and, thrive on positive reinforcement and praise.
I think, the interaction is absolutely the most important bit. And even before they're verbally responding to you, I think it's really important to be making those conversations, around books, around anything.
Yeah, so they might not produce the sounds for a while, but they are still very much perceiving them and drawing it all into their...
And they'll have facial expressions and they'll have gestures and all of those. It's important to be picking up on them and using them as cues.
That's right, brilliant. In our second part of our interview, we're going to talk about how children learn more than one language, and I shall look forward to discussing that with you shortly.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Bye.